In a shocking moment of injustice, a police officer crossed the line when he targeted an elderly black woman, humiliating her in front of a crowd. This wasn't just an abuse of power. It was an act of cruelty that would soon come back to haunt him. Mrs. Evelyn, a kind and dignified 72-year-old, had done nothing wrong, but that didn't stop Officer Mark from unleashing his prejudice. What happened next left everyone stunned. Just 5 minutes after his appalling actions, the tables turned in a way no one could have expected. The officer's lesson was harsh, swift, and unforgettable. This is more than a story about injustice. It's a reminder of how quickly karma can strike. Stay tuned, because you won't believe how this story ends. Comment where you're watching from, and get ready for a twist that will leave you speechless. Mrs. Evelyn, a 72-year-old woman with a kind heart, was known in her neighborhood for her warm smiles and polite demeanor. She lived alone in a small apartment and was fiercely independent, despite her age. Every day she walked with her cane to the nearby grocery store, carrying herself with quiet dignity. On this particular afternoon, Evelyn was heading home, carrying a small bag of groceries. The sun was shining, the street was busy, and everything seemed normal. But things were about to take a shocking turn. Officer Mark, a middle-aged cop known for his rough attitude, spotted Evelyn walking. Mark had a reputation for letting his power get to his head. He often acted on assumptions and believed he could do as he pleased without facing consequences. Mark approached Evelyn with a harsh expression. "What are you doing here?" he demanded loudly. Startled but calm, Evelyn replied, "I'm going home. I live just over there." She gestured toward her apartment building. "Let me see your ID," Mark barked. Evelyn, confused but compliant. She reached into her bag and handed him her ID. By now, people on the street were slowing down, sensing something wasn't right. Mark snatched the ID from her hand, glanced at it, and tossed it back. "This doesn't prove anything," he said sharply. Evelyn, holding her cane tightly, looked at him and said, "Officer, I've done nothing wrong." But Mark's tone grew harsher. "Move along," he yelled. When Evelyn didn't move quickly enough, he did something no one expected. He kicked her cane out from under her. Evelyn stumbled, her groceries spilling onto the ground as she struggled to regain her balance. Gasps filled the air. People in the crowd began shouting, and phones were raised to record the scene. Evelyn looked up at Mark, steadying herself, and said calmly, "You'll regret this." The crowd's outrage grew, and within moments, the scene was about to change in a way Mark never saw coming. The moment Officer Mark kicked Mrs. Evelyn's cane, the entire atmosphere shifted. A crowd began to form, their faces filled with shock and anger. Phones were raised, capturing every second of what had just happened. Mrs. Evelyn, still holding on to her dignity, bent down to pick up her cane and groceries while the crowd murmured in disbelief. "What are you doing?" a man in the crowd shouted. "She's an elderly woman." Another voice added, "You can't treat people like that." But Officer Mark, unmoved by the growing outrage, simply barked back, "Stay out of it. This is police business." Mrs. Evelyn straightened up, her hand clutching her cane for support. Her voice was calm but firm as she said, "You think this makes you strong? Kicking an old woman? You're going to regret this, officer." Mark scoffed, his arrogance showing. "You don't get to tell me what I'll regret," he replied dismissively. He turned to the crowd and shouted, "Move along. This doesn't concern you." But the crowd didn't budge. In fact, their whispers turned into angry chatter. "Someone call the police on him," a woman yelled. "This needs to go viral," another said, recording the scene on her phone. The tension grew heavier with every second. Mark, feeling the pressure, stepped closer to Mrs. Evelyn. "You're causing a scene," he said harshly. "Just go home before you make things worse for yourself." But Evelyn didn't back down. She stood tall, despite her frail body, and met his gaze with quiet strength. "I've lived long enough to know that bullies like you always face their reckoning," she said. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Mark hesitated. His confidence faltered slightly, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. The crowd's frustration turned to action as one bystander called out, "Isn't that?" Heads turned as a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and a tall man in a crisp suit stepped out. His presence immediately silenced the crowd. He walked directly toward Mrs. Evelyn, his expression filled with concern. "Are you okay, Aunt Evelyn?" he asked gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. Evelyn nodded, giving him a faint smile. "I'm fine now," she replied. The man turned to Mark, his expression hardening. "Do you have any idea who you just kicked?" he said, his voice sharp and authoritative. Mark, now visibly uncomfortable, stammered, I just, she was, "Save it," the man interrupted, holding up a badge. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they realized he was a high-ranking official. "I'm Deputy Chief Daniels," he said firmly, "and this is my aunt. You just assaulted her in front of half the neighborhood." Mark's face turned pale. The confidence he had moments ago vanished entirely. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The crowd, now energized by the turn of events, began shouting louder. "Justice for Mrs. Evelyn!" someone yelled. Daniels stepped closer to Mark, his tone growing colder. "I hope you've enjoyed your career, Officer Mark," he said, "because it's over." Mark's harsh lesson had only just begun. The weight of his actions was catching up to him, and it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The street had come to a standstill. Bystanders, phones in hand, stood frozen as Deputy Chief Daniels confronted Officer Mark. The tension was electric, every word cutting through the thick silence that had settled over the once busy city corner. Evelyn sat nearby on a bench, holding her cane tightly, her quiet strength radiating despite the humiliation she had just endured. Daniel stood tall, his voice calm but authoritative. "Officer Mark," he said, his tone carrying the weight of his rank, "do you understand the severity of what you just did?" Mark shifted nervously, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. "Sir, I didn't realize—" Daniels raised a hand to silence him. Didn't realize she's an elderly woman who deserves your respect. Didn't realize you were abusing your power in broad daylight. Or didn't realize someone like me might be watching." The crowd murmured in agreement. "He thought he could get away with it," someone whispered. Another person added, "He needs to pay for what he's done." Mark stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I thought she was resisting, sir. I was just trying to do my job." Daniel stepped closer, his expression hardening. "Your job is to serve and protect, not humiliate and harm. Do you think kicking an elderly woman is an acceptable part of doing your job?" Mark looked down, his hands twitching at his sides. "No, sir," he muttered. Daniels didn't let up. "Look around you, Mark," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "These people saw what you did. They filmed it. They heard her tell you she lived here. And yet, you still chose to escalate the situation instead of de-escalating it. Explain that." Mark opened his mouth but found no words. The weight of Daniel's questions, combined with the eyes of the crowd on him, was too much. He glanced at Mrs. Evelyn, who sat silently, her gaze steady and unwavering. The crowd wasn't silent, though. "He's only sorry because he got caught," a young woman shouted. "He doesn't deserve that badge," another added. Phones stayed raised, recording every second as the confrontation played out. Daniels turned to Evelyn, his voice softening. "Aunt Evelyn," he said, addressing her with care, "are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Evelyn shook her head, though her hand trembled slightly as she gripped her cane. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice steady despite the quiver in her hands. "What hurts more than my fall is knowing this isn't the first time he's done this. It's just the first time someone important enough was watching." Her words hit the crowd like a thunderclap. They erupted into cheers and shouts of agreement. "She's right," someone yelled. "This happens all the time, and they just cover it up." Daniels looked back at Mark, his expression colder than before. "Did you hear that? She shouldn't have to rely on someone important enough being around to get justice. Your actions today are a disgrace, not just to your badge, but to this entire community." Mark's face turned pale. "Sir, I made a mistake. I didn't mean—" Daniels cut him off. "You didn't mean. You made a choice, Mark. You chose to treat her with disrespect. You chose to abuse your power, and now you're going to face the consequences." The crowd roared in support. "Hold him accountable," someone shouted. "Make sure he doesn't do this again," another added. Daniels pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "This is Deputy Chief Daniels," he said into the phone, his voice calm but firm. "I need internal affairs at my location immediately. We have an officer who needs to be placed on administrative leave pending investigation." Mark's eyes widened. "Sir, please," he began, his voice desperate. "I'll do better. I'll go through training. I'll apologize. Just don't end my career." Daniels looked at him with a mix of disappointment and resolve. "You think your career is my priority right now. My priority is ensuring this community knows that officers like you are held accountable. You should have thought about your career before you kicked an elderly woman in public." Mark's shoulders slumped. He looked at the crowd, at Evelyn, and then back at Daniels. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "That's not good enough. You owe her an apology, a real one." Mark hesitated, then turned to Evelyn. His voice shook as he spoke. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. I was wrong. I shouldn't have treated you like that." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "You're sorry because you're caught," she said. "But if this makes you think twice the next time you deal with someone, maybe it was worth it." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices echoing through the street. Daniels turned back to Mark. "Consider yourself officially off duty until Internal Affairs completes their investigation," he said. "Now, hand me your badge." Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over his badge. The crowd watched, silent and tense. Finally, he unpinned it and handed it to Daniels, his face pale and defeated. Daniels held up the badge, addressing the crowd. "This badge represents service and protection," he said. "It's a privilege, not a weapon, and anyone who abuses it will face the consequences. That's a promise." The crowd cheered, their applause ringing out as Mark was escorted away by 2 arriving officers from Internal Affairs. Evelyn remained seated, her quiet strength evident as neighbors and strangers alike approached her to offer words of support. "You're a hero," one woman said. "Thank you for standing up to him." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I just hope this makes a difference," she said. "For me, for you, and for everyone." Daniels knelt beside her. "It already has," he said. "You're stronger than most people I know, Aunt Evelyn, and I'll make sure his actions don't go unanswered." As the crowd began to disperse, Evelyn and Daniels sat quietly for a moment. The street was returning to its usual rhythm, but the impact of what had just happened lingered. "Do you think he'll learn from this?" Evelyn asked softly. Daniels looked thoughtful. "If he doesn't, the system will make sure he never has the chance to do it again," he said. "But the real change starts with moments like this, when people see that no one is above accountability." Evelyn nodded, a faint smile on her lips. Then maybe today was worth it after all. The sun began to set as Daniels helped her up, and the two walked away together, leaving behind a scene that would spark conversations, change perspectives, and demand justice far beyond that small city corner. As Officer Mark was escorted to the side by Internal Affairs, the crowd remained energized, their eyes fixed on the aftermath of the confrontation. Mrs. Evelyn, still seated on the bench, adjusted her cane and looked at Deputy Chief Daniels with a calm yet knowing expression. The crowd began to speculate. "Did you see how fast the chief got here? He knew this would happen," someone whispered. Another person chimed in, "No way. There's more to this story." The murmurs grew louder, filled with curiosity and disbelief. Daniels turned back to the crowd, his voice firm yet calm. "What you've witnessed today is more than an abuse of power. It's a failure to respect the people we're sworn to serve. This is unacceptable, and I promise this officer will face the consequences." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the air. Mark, standing awkwardly nearby, glanced nervously at the people surrounding him. He looked utterly defeated, but no one seemed to pity him. All eyes were on Mrs. Evelyn now, and the energy in the crowd shifted from outrage to admiration for the elderly woman's quiet strength. Then came the twist that no one was expecting. Daniels, now standing beside Evelyn, took out his phone and made another call. "It's me," he said into the phone. "Yes, we're ready." He hung up and turned to Evelyn. "You've been incredibly brave today. It's time we make sure this message is heard everywhere." Moments later, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The doors opened, and out stepped a small team of reporters and a camera crew. Gasps rippled through the crowd as microphones were raised, and cameras started rolling. "What's going on?" someone asked. Another person replied, "This is about to go viral. She's going to tell her story." One of the reporters, a woman with a calm but commanding presence, approached Evelyn and knelt beside her. "Mrs. Evelyn," she said softly, "thank you for agreeing to share your story. The world needs to hear this." Evelyn, who had remained composed through the entire ordeal, now looked slightly hesitant. "I didn't do this to make a scene," she said, her voice steady. "I just want people to know this isn't right." Daniels leaned down to speak to her. "Aunt Evelyn, your voice is powerful. What you've been through today reflects what so many others have endured in silence. If you're willing to share this, it could help bring change." Evelyn nodded slowly, her resolve strengthening. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." The camera crew adjusted their equipment as the reporter began to speak. "We're here live with Mrs. Evelyn Daniels, an elderly woman who was the victim of police brutality today in broad daylight. Thanks to the quick action of her nephew, Deputy Chief Daniels, the officer involved is already facing consequences." The crowd grew quiet, their attention fixed on Evelyn as the microphone was placed in front of her. "Mrs. Evelyn," the reporter continued, "what would you like to say to those watching, especially people who've experienced similar injustices?" Evelyn held her cane firmly as she spoke. Her voice was calm but filled with strength. "I want everyone to know that silence won't protect you. If someone disrespects you, if someone abuses their power, you have the right to stand up for yourself. I've lived a long life, and I've seen too many people treated unfairly. Today, I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to say, no more." Her words resonated deeply, and the crowd erupted in applause once again. People nodded and cheered, their phones still recording. Evelyn continued, "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been judged, mistreated, or ignored. Change starts when we speak up, and I hope my voice can help someone else find theirs." Mark, standing off to the side, watched in silence. The gravity of his actions sank in further as he saw the impact of Evelyn's words on the crowd and the world watching through their screens. Daniels stepped in to add his own remarks. "What happened here today is a stark reminder of the responsibility that comes with wearing this badge. We're here to protect, not harm. And when one of us fails, we all fail. That's why accountability is non-negotiable." As Daniels spoke, the live stream began gaining traction online. Within minutes, comments and reactions poured in from viewers around the world. Some expressed outrage at the officer's actions, while others praised Evelyn's courage and Daniels's swift response. The reporter wrapped up the interview, thanking Evelyn for her bravery. The crowd, now fully rallied around her, began chanting, "Justice for Evelyn." Their voices filled the air, echoing down the street. The twist, however, wasn't just the arrival of the cameras or Evelyn's powerful speech. It was the ripple effect it created. By the end of the day, the footage of the incident and Evelyn's story had gone viral, sparking a national conversation about accountability and respect in law enforcement. For Mark, the lesson was harsh but clear. His face was plastered across screens everywhere as the officer who had abused his power and faced swift consequences. For Evelyn, it was a moment of vindication, not just for herself, but for countless others who had endured similar injustices. The street, once filled with tension and anger, now buzzed with hope. Evelyn's words had ignited a spark that was spreading quickly, and it was clear that the lesson Mark learned wasn't just for him. It was for everyone. The crowd was still energized as the camera crews wrapped up and began packing their equipment. Mrs. Evelyn sat on the bench, surrounded by people offering her words of support and gratitude for her courage. Her calm demeanor never wavered, though the events of the day were clearly weighing on her. Officer Mark stood to the side, flanked by members of Internal Affairs. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped, and his badge now gone. The consequences of his actions were starting to settle in, but the public outrage was far from over. He could hear snippets of conversation from the crowd. "This isn't just about her," one man said. "This happens all the time, and most people don't have someone like Deputy Chief Daniels to step in." "Exactly," another woman agreed. "She's lucky she has someone powerful on her side." But what about all the people who don't? Mark looked down at his feet, knowing that his actions had not only cost him his position, but also exposed a deeper issue within the system he represented. Deputy Chief Daniels approached Mrs. Evelyn, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "Aunt Evelyn, you've done more today than most people could even dream of. You've sparked something big." Evelyn gave him a faint smile, adjusting her cane as she spoke. "It's not just about today, Marcus," she said, using his first name for the first time in front of the crowd. "This has been happening for decades. I've lived through worse than this. But it's time for people like him to understand that this isn't just another day at work. These actions have real consequences." Daniels nodded. "And we'll make sure those consequences stick," he assured her. "Internal Affairs is already investigating. His suspension will be immediate, and I'll personally ensure the footage recorded here today is reviewed." Nearby, one of the reporters who had stayed back approached Daniels. "Chief Daniels," she began, her tone professional but empathetic, "what steps will the department take to ensure incidents like this don't happen again?" Daniels turned to face the reporter, his voice steady and firm. "This department has a responsibility to serve and protect every member of this community. Officer Mark's actions were unacceptable, and he will be held accountable. Beyond that, we're implementing mandatory retraining for all officers, focusing on de-escalation and bias awareness. This incident is a wake-up call, not just for our department, but for law enforcement everywhere." The reporter nodded, satisfied with his response, and turned to leave. The crowd began to thin out as people returned to their routines, but the energy of the moment lingered. It was clear this was more than an isolated incident. It had become a catalyst for change. As the street quieted, Evelyn and Daniels walked back toward her apartment. "Are you sure you're okay?" Daniels asked, his concern evident. Evelyn chuckled softly. "You've asked me that 3 times already, Marcus," she said. "I'm fine. My pride's a little bruised, but my spirit is intact." They reached her door, and Evelyn paused, leaning on her cane. "Marcus," she said, her voice softer now, "today wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who's ever been mistreated, ignored, or silenced. If what happened to me can make even one person feel less alone, then it was worth it." Daniels placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than anyone I know," he said, "and you've made a bigger impact today than you realize." Evelyn smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Maybe," she said, "but it's not just about me being strong. It's about all of us finding the strength to stand up when something isn't right." Meanwhile, the footage of the incident continued to spread online. Social media platforms were flooded with videos of Mark's actions and Evelyn's powerful words. Hashtags like #Justice for Evelyn and #Stand Up for Change began trending, sparking national conversations about police accountability and respect for elders. The department, under pressure from the public, issued a formal statement condemning Mark's actions and pledging to make immediate changes. For many, this felt like a step in the right direction, but Evelyn knew there was still a long way to go. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn became a quiet symbol of resilience. She was invited to speak at community events, where her message of dignity and justice resonated deeply. "It's not about revenge," she often said. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Mark, on the other hand, faced the consequences of his actions. His suspension quickly turned into a dismissal, and he became the subject of an ongoing investigation. The footage of him kicking Evelyn became a stark reminder of the importance of holding people in power accountable. In one community meeting, Evelyn shared a story from her younger days. "I've seen so much change in my life," she said. "But change doesn't happen on its own. It happens because people like you and me decide enough is enough. We push for it. We demand it." The audience gave her a standing ovation, their applause echoing the sentiment of a community ready to move forward. Daniels, sitting in the front row, couldn't help but feel proud of his aunt's unwavering courage. As Evelyn walked home that evening, accompanied by Daniels, she felt a sense of peace. "Do you think things will really change?" she asked quietly. Daniels thought for a moment before answering. "Change is slow," he admitted. "But today was a big step. And as long as people like you keep speaking out, and people like me keep listening, I think we'll get there." Evelyn nodded, her grip on her cane steady. "Then I'll keep speaking," she said. "And I'll keep hoping." As they walked into the fading sunlight, the city around them seemed different, not just because of what had happened that day, but because of what it represented. A moment where justice had prevailed, and a promise of a better future felt just within reach. The events of that day left a lasting impact, not just on Mrs. Evelyn and Officer Mark, but on everyone who witnessed the incident and those who saw it online. Mrs. Evelyn's calm strength and powerful words became a rallying cry for justice, reminding everyone that standing up against injustice, no matter how small the act, can lead to real change. Officer Mark's actions resulted in his dismissal, and his case became a subject of national discussion. For many, it was a reminder that abuse of power cannot go unchecked. For Mrs. Evelyn, it wasn't about revenge. "What I want is not punishment," she said in one of her community speeches. "What I want is accountability and change." Her story inspired people around the world to reflect on how they treat others and what it means to truly serve and protect. It also brought to light the importance of speaking out when we see something wrong. And now, we turn the question to you. If you were there that day, would you have stepped up to support Mrs. Evelyn? What would you have done in the face of such injustice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and share it to help spread awareness. And make sure to subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power of standing together. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.